Imagine a single jet fighter, built more than 80 years ahead of its time, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the Second World War. Not a squadron, not a prototype from a lab. One real, fully armed, fully fueled aircraft dropped into a war fought with propellers and gut instinct instead of satellites and screens. Everything breaks. The story stops being about machines. It becomes about what power does to people who have no way to understand it. Picture the year 1943. The skies over Europe are loud with piston engines and desperate men. Spitfires, Messerschmitts, bombers dropping fire on cities below. Now imagine one single aircraft appears in that sky that belongs to none of it. Not a squadron, not a fleet. One machine, alone, with no explanation for how it got there. A Eurofighter Typhoon, built more than half a century in the future. Somehow, it ends up in the hands of Adolf Hitler himself, discovered almost by accident, a single impossible object nobody around him can explain. Faster than sound, armed with weapons that can kill from 40 miles away before the enemy even sees a shape in the clouds. What happens next isn't really a war story. It's a study in what humans do when they're handed something they cannot understand. Start with the obvious question. Could it even fly? Yes, for a while. The Eurofighter runs on refined jet fuel, precision-manufactured parts, and a mind spread across dozens of onboard computers. None of that exists in 1943. So the countdown starts the moment the engine powers on. Every flight burns through fuel that can never be replaced. Every missile fired empties a magazine that can never be refilled. There is no factory on Earth in that decade capable of building a single circuit board inside that cockpit, let alone the jet turbine keeping it in the air. Historian Richard Overy has spent decades studying how leaders and civilians reacted to weapons they perceived as unstoppable. His research on the V-2 rocket program is telling. The V-2 was crude by comparison, barely a controlled explosion aimed in a general direction. And still, it terrified an entire population. Not because of what it could do, but because of what it represented. An enemy so far ahead technologically that resistance felt pointless. Now imagine that same fear, but justified. A single jet with radar that can track a formation of bombers before they've crossed the coastline. Missiles that don't need a pilot to see the target, only to know it exists. In one afternoon, that aircraft could shoot down more planes than an entire squadron might manage in a week. Command centers on the ground would receive reports that made no sense. Pilots vanishing from radar with no warning. Enemy aircraft turning at angles 1940s engineering considered structurally impossible. Here's where it gets interesting. Not in the air, in the meetings after. Nazi leadership, and Hitler in particular, had a documented obsession with so-called wonder weapons. Historian Ian Kershaw's research on the regime's final years describes a leadership increasingly detached from military reality, chasing miracle technology as morale and territory collapsed. Rocket programs, jet prototypes, weapons rushed into service half-finished because someone believed they could reverse an unwinnable war. A fully functional aircraft from 80 years in the future would fit that obsession perfectly. Except this one would actually work, at least for a while. That's the twist most people miss here. The danger isn't the aircraft, it's the decision-making around it. A leadership already prone to gambling on miracle weapons, suddenly handed one that outperforms anything they've seen, doesn't respond with caution. It responds with escalation. Fly it constantly, push it further, extract every advantage before it breaks down or runs dry. Nobody in that command structure understands software update or maintenance cycle. They see a war-winning machine and demand it be used like one, right until the moment it simply stops. No warning, no explanation anyone in 1943 could offer the public. Psychologist Philip Tetlock has spent his career studying how people make decisions under extreme uncertainty, facing something outside their existing framework for risk. His research shows decision-makers facing an overwhelming advantage tend to overestimate how long it will last. They plan as if the anomaly is permanent. They rarely plan for the moment it disappears.
That's what would happen. The jet flies a handful of sorties. Maybe it changes one battle.
Maybe it shoots down 40 aircraft before a mechanical failure grounds it for good, or before the fuel simply runs out, and no chemist in the country can replicate the formula. And then, silence. A leadership that has just tasted an advantage beyond anything in human history has to explain, to its own people and its own military, why it vanished as suddenly as it arrived. Would they even try to study it? Almost certainly. German engineers of the era, some of them brilliant, would be given access to a cockpit built from composite materials nobody had names for yet, wiring for a computer architecture decades from being invented, and weapons systems requiring microchips that wouldn't exist until the 1970s. It would be like handing a locksmith from the 1800s a smartphone and asking him to figure out how to make more of them. Fascinating. Completely useless as a path forward. This is the part of the story that reframes everything. The aircraft itself was never the real weapon. The real weapon was the belief it created. Belief that a single leap in technology could undo years of accumulated disadvantage. Belief that one miracle object could rewrite the outcome of a war grounded in industrial capacity, manpower, and time. That belief has shown up again and again throughout history, long before jets and long after them. Anthropologists studying cargo cults in the Pacific Islands during and after the Second World War documented something eerily similar. Isolated communities watched Allied forces arrive with airplanes, radios, and supplies beyond anything they had ever seen. Some built replica airstrips and wooden airplanes, hoping the same magic would return if they mimicked the ritual closely enough. It wasn't foolishness. It was a very human response to encountering something whose mechanism you cannot see, only its results. You reach for meaning. You build a story around the object because the object itself gives you nothing to hold on to, without understanding how it actually works. That's the real thread connecting a 1940s dictator to a Pacific Island community to you, scrolling through headlines about technology you'll never fully understand yourself. When something outperforms your framework for what's possible, the instinct isn't curiosity first. It's narrative. You decide what it means before you understand what it is. Bring it back to the sky over 1943 one more time. That jet, impossible and glowing white against propeller-driven silhouettes, was never going to win a war. Wars are won by supply chains, industrial output, manpower, and time, none of which a single aircraft can manufacture out of thin air. But it would have done something else entirely. It would have proven, in the starkest way possible, that a technological gap large enough doesn't just change outcomes, it changes how people think, panic, gamble, and eventually cope with losing an advantage they never understood in the first place. Now think about your own life, sitting in a decade where jets like that one aren't fiction anymore. They're inventory. Somewhere, technology exists right now that would look just as impossible to you as that Typhoon would have looked to a pilot in 1943. You just don't know what it is yet. And when you eventually encounter it, the real question won't be whether you understand the machine. It'll be whether you can resist the same instinct that gripped a desperate command structure 80 years ago. The instinct to believe a single leap forward changes everything, when history keeps proving, again and again, that it's never the object that decides the outcome. It's what you do with the time before it disappears.